best 13 seeds on keto. There's chia seed and flax seed and pumpkin seed that are enormously popular as keto snacks. But how good are they really for keto and for health? There's also a seed called quinoa that's very popular, but how good is that for keto? So today we're going to answer all those questions and more coming right up. Hey, I'm Dr. Ekberg. I'm a holistic doctor and a former Olympic decathlete. And if you want to truly master health by understanding how the body really works, make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell so that you don't miss anything. Most people start low-carb and ketogenic lifestyles to reduce insulin and insulin resistance and to lose weight. And in doing that, they can often reduce inflammation and reverse a lot of other health conditions. But if you eat the wrong kind of fat, then you could actually promote inflammation and offset some of the benefits that you otherwise get from the ketogenic and low-carb lifestyle. So let's look at why that is. So I'll get into the ranking of the seeds in a moment, but before I do that, I want to explain some of the basics, and I urge you to stay with me on that and pay really close attention, because if you don't understand the basics of why the different fats do what they do, then you won't understand why I'm ranking the seeds the way that I do and how much you can eat of each one and so forth. So let's dig into that. There are two essential fatty acids in the body. It's an omega-3 called alpha-linolenic acid and an omega-6 called linoleic acid. And both of them are necessary, both are good, but what's bad is when they get out of balance, when one starts to dominate. And the best balance is a 1-to-1 ratio, and you can go as far as 1-to-4 and still stay in balance. The problem is most modern diets are about a 1-to-25. So the omega-6s are vastly dominant. They're pushing the omega-3s way out of balance. And why does that matter? Because these essential fatty acids, it's not really what the body is looking for. It needs them to turn into other things that the body needs. So this one can become arachidonic acid. The omega-6 is in the arachidonic acid pathway, which can turn into prostaglandin 2, which is pro-inflammatory. And again, we don't like too much inflammation, but some inflammation is necessary. It's part of the healing process, and at certain times the body needs to do that. But it doesn't need 25 times as much as the other pathway. So the other pathway is the omega-3, and there the body can turn that into EPA and eventually into DHA. The EPA turns into prostaglandin 3, which is a neutral prostaglandin. So it's not really anti-inflammatory, but it is anti-inflammatory in the sense that it balances the pro-inflammatory pathway. And then the DHA, that is the thing that the body is ultimately looking for as a building block, because your brain and your nervous system is mostly fat, and the most important component of that fat is DHA. It is the dominant building block of your nervous system, and if you don't have enough, then the body has to compromise. The nervous system will compromise and put other fatty acids in, but it won't work quite as well. So signaling quality will be compromised as a result. So a lot of plant proponents and a lot of vegans, they think that they can just eat any kind of plant omega-3 and the body will convert it into the DHA that it needs. And that's theoretically possible, but in reality it really doesn't work very well, because less than 5% of the ALA gets converted into EPA and less than 0.5% gets converted into DHA. So even though you don't need a whole lot of DHA, you would have to eat enormous amounts. Even if you drank half a cup of flax oil per day, you would probably just barely make enough DHA. And drinking that amount of flax oil is probably not something that you want to keep up. So the ratios in the diet still matter, and it's still important to get some plant omega-3s, but not necessarily so you can turn them into DHA, but because these two pathways compete with each other. There's an enzyme, the name is not important, but delta-6 desaturase for those who really need to know. And the more omega-6s that you have in the diet, the more those omega-6s are going to suck up that enzyme and going to dominate that pathway. So if you have 25 times as much omega-6s, then there's going to be 25 times as much of that enzyme allocated to this pathway versus that one. So the conversion is going to be terrible. But if you eat more of the plant omega-3s, even if you don't convert a whole lot, at least you will limit the amount of the enzyme that goes into the pro-inflammatory pathway. So there's two reasons that you're looking to increase your omega-3s. One is that you can potentially turn some of it into DHA, but not much of that is going to happen. The other reason is that if you increase the omega-3s, you will at least compete and reduce the omega-6 pro-inflammatory pathway. So when it comes to fat balance, to balance these things out, there's two things that you're looking for. One is to increase the DHA for brain food. And the only really powerful, reliable way to do that is to eat fish and to take fish oil. Then you can eat grass-fed beef and dairy and butter, but it doesn't really contain enough DHA to give a substantial boost to the amount. It does help a little bit, and these animal products contain the finished version, the DHA. What it does do is it's sort of neutral because you can eat the meat and at least you're not adding a bunch of omega-6s. You can also increase your flax oil, your seed intake of the seeds that are very high in omega-3s, and we'll talk about those. And again, they're sort of neutral in their benefit. They're not going to add a lot of DHA, but they will be, they allow you to eat a fat that doesn't contribute with omega-6s, and they will compete a little bit with this pathway and hold it back. So those are all good things to do, but the only really substantial way is to eat fish and take fish oil supplements. The other thing you're looking for is to reduce the inflammation. And now the most powerful way is to reduce the total amount of omega-6s. And in doing that, there's two things you're looking for. Is you want to reduce your consumption of vegetable oil. And those are the seed oils. It's everything that they use in commercial cooking. So when you go out to eat, you can be sure that they're using these omega-6 vegetable oils because they are so inexpensive. You can also reduce your consumption of grain-fed meat because when you feed the cow grass, it ends up about a 1-to-1 ratio. So that's where it's neutral. But if you feed it grain, now it's going to have a lot of those omega-6s, and now you're shifting the pathway over in this direction again. I know that was a little technical. I hope that you could follow because it's going to be so important now that we start looking at the different kinds of seeds and why we want to use more or less of them. Number 13 on the list is quinoa. And it's not because it's a super terrible food, but from a keto, from a low-carb perspective, it has 57 grams of net carbs. So a lot of people think of it as a grain and they use it as a grain. So in that sense, it's better than most grains because it has a lot of protein and it is gluten-free. But on a keto diet, you really can't eat quinoa because it's so starchy. Number 12 is pomegranate seed. And again, it's a very, very nutritious food. It's very healthy. And a lot of people don't think of it as a seed, even though it has that name, because it's really more of a fruit, nutritionally speaking. And on a keto diet, then it doesn't have hardly any fat, but it has 15 grams of carbohydrate and it's almost all sugar. So you could have a couple tablespoons maybe. It's sort of like a berry if you keep it really limited because it's very nutritious, but you cannot eat a whole lot of it on a keto diet. Fat-wise, it hardly has any fat at all, so it's not going to affect your omega-6s or inflammation or anything like that. Number 11 is safflower seed, and that's one of the most popular ones to make oil from, cheap cooking oil. It has 38% fat, so again, all these numbers are out of 100 grams of food, which is about 3.5 ounces. So all the numbers are in percentages of the amount, the weight of that food. So safflower is 38% fat, but 34% net carbs. It's a very, very starchy. It has almost zero omega-3s, and it has 28% omega-6s. So you can't eat a whole lot of safflower before you start adding up the carbs and you start adding up the omega-6s and pushing that inflammatory number. Number 10 is watermelon seed. A lot of people like to eat those seeds and they are quite nutritious, but it has 47% fat, 15% net carbs, but it has 30% omega-6s. So again, it's quite a bit of fat, but most of it is omega-6s, which is the pro-inflammatory. So let's just talk a little bit about how much omega-6s are you looking for. Well, there's not like an exact number because it's going to depend on how much omega-3s you get in your diet that's going to offset the balance. But you probably want to keep the total consumption of omega-6 fats somewhere under 20 or maybe even 15 grams a day. So when you look at something that has 30 or 28 grams of omega-6s, that means if you ate 50 grams, if you just had 2 ounces of those, you already maxed out your allowance of omega-6s for that day. Number 9 is poppy seed. It's a very tasty little seed that you can use sort of as a spice. You're probably not going to eat any huge quantities of it. So carb-wise, you're not really in any danger if you have a teaspoon as part of something. The omega-6s will add up pretty quickly though at 28%. Number 8, sunflower seed. So 52% fat, pretty low on the net carbs, 11 grams, but it has 23 grams of omega-6s, 23% omega-6s. So sunflower seeds is one of those things that once you get going, you can probably eat quite a lot. So the omega-6s and the inflammation is going to add up pretty quick. Number 7 is sesame seeds, and even if people don't sit and crunch a whole lot on sesame seeds, it's very popular in Middle Eastern cuisine as something called tahini. And in moderation, again, it's not bad, but it has 12 grams of carbs, which isn't going to be adding up too much. But again, if you're trying to stay under 20 grams of omega-6s, then even an ounce is going to give you like 7 or 8 grams. So again, realize that these numbers, you're going to have to fit them into your daily budget, just like you fit the carbohydrates in a ketogenic diet. So it counts everything that you eat, all sources for that day. So everything to this point I've done in red, which means that I pretty much recommend you stay away from it. Some of it you could do from a keto perspective, some of it you could do from a omega-6 perspective, but overall I really wouldn't suggest you eat a lot of these. You could have a little bit here and there, and the same holds true for some other seeds that I found in my research, like fennel seed and mustard seed and cumin seed and fenugreek seed, etc. Even if they run a little bit high on net carbs, then you're not going to consume. They're more like spices, so you're not going to consume a lot of them. So feel free to use those. You would probably never eat more than a teaspoon of any of those at one time. But now we're at number 6, so now we're getting into the more recommended range. So number 6 is hemp seed, and this one is kind of a big maybe because a lot of people love hemp seed. It's one of those highly promoted superfoods, and I've used some of it in smoothies, but I'm starting to think twice about this because it's promoted as having more omega-3s and more omega-6s, like more of the essential fats than any other of these seeds, which is true when you add them up. There's a lot. It's 35 grams, and it even looks like a pretty good ratio. So they promote this and they say, oh, look, it's like a 2.5 to 1 ratio between omega-3 and omega-6. So that would fit right into the 1 to 4 ratio. But here's the problem. If you put a couple of ounces of that in your smoothie, now you already have 15 grams of omega-6s. This omega-3, the 10 grams, 10% of omega-3s can compete a little bit, but it can't undo the weight, the substance, the mass of omega-6 that gets into the system. So what's more important even than the ratio is the total amount of omega-6s, because the omega-6s are pro-inflammatory and there's really no amount of omega-3s that can completely offset that. The other thing to realize is that both of these essential fatty acids they're necessary in small amounts, but in very large amounts they become highly reactive. They're polyunsaturated, so they react very easily with oxygen under heat and light. So you're risking increasing your oxidation, your oxidative damage in the body by using either of these. They're fantastic in small amounts, but you don't want to just eat a ton of omega-6s and then try to eat a ton of omega-3s to compensate. It's really not a good idea. You want to try to keep the omega-6s down, get some high-quality omega-3s into balance, but don't try to eat a ton of either one. Number 5 was a new one to me when I looked into this, and on paper it looks like the superfood, and there's lots of articles describing it as the superfood. And it's called, I think, Sacha Inchi. Someone called it Inca peanuts or something like that. And on paper it looks fantastic. 50% fat, 0% net carbs, because all the carbs are fiber in this puppy. And it has 24% omega-3s. It's the highest vegetable source of omega-3s on the planet, and it has 18 grams, 18% of omega-6s. So the ratio looks sensational, and again, by the same reasoning that we just went through, it still provides too much omega-6s, and you can't just undo the effect of omega-6s by adding a bunch of omega-3s. So have some, but have it in moderation, and don't think of it as a superfood. Number 4, now we're getting into the pretty good ones. And pumpkin seed has 49% fat, it's very low in net carbs, it has virtually no omega-3s, and 8 grams of omega-6s. So again, it's a very, very nice snack. It has lots of nutrients, and you could eat a good bit. Like if you had 3.5 ounces worth, you'd be at 8 grams for the day. So if you had half of that, you'd be at 4 grams. You could probably fit a handful of pumpkin seeds into your budget and still stay in a really good place inflammation-wise. But again, it's very easy to overdo, and you want to keep it in mind. So it's not like you can eat as much as you want, right? But it's kind of recommended, but not one of the top super 3 that we're going to go to next. Number 3 is cocoa nibs. So what's that? Well, the cocoa bean that you make chocolate out of, when you cut it into pieces and you dry it, that becomes cocoa nibs. And some people use that as candy. I think it needs a little bit of sweetness. It's sort of bitter. It's like tastes pretty much like 100% chocolate. It's essentially what it is, but they still has some fiber and protein in it. But it's great to use for smoothies if you want like the whole thing. If you're gonna add some chocolate flavor to your smoothie and you want the most unspoiled chocolate you can find, then cocoa nibs are going to be a great source for that. 43% fat, net carbs are very low, virtually no omega-3s, but only 1.2% omega-6s. Most of the fat is saturated, which is a great fat. It's stable, it doesn't react, it's neutral, all right? So you probably can't eat a lot of cocoa nibs. They're bitter. It's sort of like you probably use a half an ounce or so in a smoothie, but feel free to use that. It's going to add lots of nutrients and it's not going to add hardly any omega-6s. At the top of the list, I'm going to unveil number 1 and 2 at the same time because they're sort of a tie for me. It is number 1 flaxseed, number 2 is chia seed. And different people are going to have their favorite, but let me tell you why I like the way I do. And like I said, I just had to pick one, but they're pretty much equal. They are both high in fat. They're extremely low in net carbs. You really can't eat enough of them to make a difference in your carb intake. The omega-3s are very high. So again, even though you're not necessarily going to make DHA out of them, they will displace a lot of the omega-6s. You'll eat a good fat that is not part of the omega-6 pathway. And the omega-6s are only 6%. So the flaxseed has like a 4-to-1 ratio and the chia has a 3-to-1 ratio. So some considerations about this though is that the omega-3s are extremely sensitive. They will go rancid in a heartbeat. That's why all the flaxseed oil that they sell is in the fridge in dark bottles under vacuum. And the moment that you open the oil, they only last for a few weeks, all right? So you want to be very careful with these. They're protected by their shell, but once you break the shell, they go rancid in a heartbeat. So what I do anytime I use these, I either use the whole thing and I put it in a smoothie and break it right then and there, or I grind them up ahead of time and I store them in the freezer. So that way they keep for several months. Both of them are also fantastic sources of fiber. So if you're looking for good fiber, both for gut motility and to feed the bacteria, then both of these are awesome sources. They're also containing what's called a gelatinous fiber, so they can thicken things. A lot of people like to put a tablespoon or 2 into water and just have it gel, and then you can sort of eat or drink that and all the fiber is sort of soaking up the water. So that can be quite filling, but it also gives you a lot of nutrients, so you could have a snack that way. Flaxseed is a little more stubborn. I don't know that you can really soak it and have it break the shell. Therefore, with flax, realize that if you just swallow the seed, it's pretty much a waste. It's going to go straight through you unaffected. So you have to break the shell of the seed first. You could chew it if you have a lot of patience. I wouldn't recommend it. It takes forever. I would suggest you put it in a blender or you grind it some other way right before you're going to use it. So I recently did a video on nuts on keto, and I had a similar format, but I also shared the omega-3 to omega-6 ratio. And I didn't do that here because I realized it was a little confusing because it's not the ratio that matters as much as keeping the total amount of omega-6s down. And I hadn't really thought that through, so if you go watch that video, if I'd done it again, I would probably move walnuts down a good bit because they're very high in omega-6s. So even though the ratio looks good, it's not that great. It's sort of like hemp seed or sacha inchi. It probably would end up down in here somewhere. If you liked this video, then you're gonna love that one. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.